Okay, you can begin.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning to our lecturer, Mr. BUSI, and fellow course-mates. I am Lisa Ann Alcala in collaboration with Mr. Phil Gabriel, and today we'll be presenting Chapter 6, Courage and Moral Leadership from the Leadership Experience, 4th edition by Richard L. DAFT. After viewing this presentation, you should be able to combine a rational approach to leadership with a concern for people and ethics, recognize your own stage of moral development and ways to accelerate your moral maturation, know and use mechanisms that enhance an ethical organizational culture, apply the principles of stewardship and servant leadership, recognize courage in others, and unlock your own potential to live and act courageously. We begin with courage and moral leadership. When we look at courage and moral leadership, we look at a leader who takes time to learn who they are, what they stand for, and has the courage to act. In times gone by, we have seen where leaders have failed to show integrity, honesty, ethics, and respect through their behavior, as well as by the things they say. But there are also leaders who have the courage to stand up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. And we see this being displayed by retired United States Army General Eric Shinseki back in 2003 in Washington, D.C. during a U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee hearing on the war in Iraq. Shinseki was the first Asian American to achieve the rank of 4-star general and the first Asian American Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And during that hearing, he chose to be honest in outlining the needs for several 100,000 soldiers to be used to keep the peace in post-war Iraq. And needless to say, that was not the response his boss, Donald Rumsfeld, who was the U.S. Secretary of Defense, was expecting from him. Rumsfeld was trying to convince the Congress that there was only the need for a few ground forces, which was the total opposite of what Shinseki was saying. And as a result, Shinseki's replacement was named more than a year before his term in office came to an end. That scenario was simply to show the moral courage that Shinseki had to say that he believed what he believed and not what his superiors wanted him to say, despite the potential damage to his own reputation and career. We know that courage means mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. We also understand that moral is concerned with the principles of right and wrong behavior. So that when we combine these two terms in leadership, what do we understand by courage and moral leadership? Well, simply put, it is a leader who demonstrates the willingness to speak out and do what is right, demonstrating superior virtues, self-discipline, and unselfishness. Moral leadership today. What do you understand by the term moral leadership? Moral leadership is distinguishing right from wrong and doing right, seeking the just, honest, and good in the practice of leadership. In times gone by, we have seen that moral leadership has gone out the window. Many leaders have failed to maintain moral and ethical standards. We see this all the time in cases where, for example, senior officers within the protective services are being charged for various offenses. And allegations made against such persons, such as Jack Warner back in 2011 and FIFA, where it was alleged that he was one of 14 persons who accepted bribes and kickbacks estimated at over $150 million over a 24-year period. Then there was Lawrence Dupre, former executive chairman of CL Financial, who was ordered to pay British American Insurance Company in excess of $122 million by a Florida judge, after the insurance company took Mr. Dupre and Mr. Brian Branca to court for breach of fiduciary duties on their part in relation to a real estate transaction. There are 3 elements to successful leadership, and these are mind, which speaks to independent thinking, heart, which speaks to emotional intelligence, and spirit, which speaks to introspection, thinking about right and wrong, and being able to have the courage to stand up for what is worthy and right. Ethical climate in US business. Although leaders in general in all organizations at some point in time experience ethical lapses, it is more often the top leaders who are put under the microscope simply because of recent unethical behaviors. When leaders fail to set and live up to high ethical standards, the organization's employees, shareholders, and the general public suffer. In the case of current employees, they will lose interest in the leaders, thereby causing their morale, commitment, and performance to be affected, and subsequently they will seek employment elsewhere. Shareholders and investors may decide to withdraw their support for the organization, and the general public, which includes potential employees and customers, will not show any interest in the organization, and current customers will essentially not be willing to do any further business with the organization. Leaders are faced with many pressures, which could cloud their ability to do the right thing. And the most dangerous obstacle for leaders are personal weaknesses and self-interest. The pressures of decreasing expenses, increasing profits, and all the while continuing to look successful are contributors to unethical behavior. Leaders sometimes do the wrong thing, so they will look good to others. So it is important as leaders to practice and maintain high ethical standards, put moral values into action, and set the examples you want followers to live by. You can resist pressures to act unethically just to avoid criticism or achieve short-term gains. Let us look at some of the traits that leaders are expected to possess. They are expected to possess integrity, which speaks to moral principles and what is done based on those beliefs. Ethics, which speaks to morality and ideas of right and wrong. Respect, which is recognizing the value and appreciation of others. And honesty, being real and not deceitful. What leaders do to make things go wrong. So what are some of the things that leaders do to make things go wrong? Leaders who are selfish and think only about themselves and their own success. They want to succeed by any means necessary. They focus on the perks of the position rather than the advancement of the organization. They do not operate in fairness and honesty. And we refer to these types of leaders as unethical leaders. Unethical leaders are dishonest and unreliable. They are biased, prejudiced, and never accept blame for failure. Because of their discourteous and disrespectful behavior towards others, followers experience a decline in their dignity. They tend to ignore wrongdoings by colleagues, thereby setting a precedent for others to follow. Where there is an unethical leader, subordinates and peers feel comfortable to act and do whatever they choose. The best way to create an environment of integrity is for leaders to stand up for what is right, or in other words, show courage. When comparing unethical versus ethical leadership, it is essentially the opposite of each other. So now let's do a short exercise. I will give a characteristic of an unethical leader, and someone can give me a characteristic, not a name please, of an ethical leader, which would simply be the opposite. So anybody, don't jump in there all at once. An unethical leader is arrogant and self-serving. Anybody, give me a characteristic of an ethical leader based on what I just said. So I am saying an unethical leader is arrogant and self-serving. If somebody give me a characteristic, the opposite of that for an ethical leader, anybody?
Humility. An ethical leader has humility.
Very good. Thank you so much, Krish. Anybody? Another characteristic. Practices.
Inclusive. An ethical leader is inclusive.
Okay. Unethical. Practices deception. Ethical.
Empowers group members.
I didn't hear.
Empowers group members.
Okay. Thank you so much. So let us look at the comparison of unethical leader and ethical. All right, so we have an unethical leader is arrogant and self-serving. Ethical possesses humility. As Chris said, unethical excessively promotes self-interest. Ethical maintains concern for the greater good. Unethical practices deception. Ethical is honest and straightforward. So we see a trend here. Ethical is just the opposite of unethical. It is very simple. So in your spare time, you can go through the comparison so you would have a better idea of the difference between the two. So moving on. Ethical leaders serve others, whereas unethical leaders focus on their own personal needs and goals. Acting like a moral leader. Being a moral leader is much more than just doing what is right. It is providing values or meaning for people to live by, inspiration to act, and motivation to accept responsibility. Despite the reality of greed and competition in an organization, leaders can be an example to others to develop and use moral values in the workplace. This onus is always on the leader to set the example to others through good ethical behavior and high moral standards. This should not only be exhibited in a leader's professional life, but also in their private life, as the ruler of scrutiny extends to every aspect of a leader's life. A leader is a model for the organization 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which means to say, whether at work or play, it must be conducted in an ethical manner. Some companies have established codes of ethics to guide employee behavior. However, there's also the need for leaders to uphold high moral standards without cutting corners and breaking or bending the rules. So we have 10 ways to act like a moral leader. 1, develop, articulate, and uphold high moral principles. Focus on what is right for the organization as well as the people involved. Set the examples you want others to live by. Be honest with yourself and others. Drive out fear and eliminate undiscussables. Establish and communicate ethic policies. Develop a backbone. Show zero tolerance for ethical violations. Which one is that? 7. Everyone should be treated fairly and respected, from the cleaner to the executive. Maintain good ethical practices 24/7, professional or private, whether seen or unseen, because as we know, practice makes perfect. Becoming a moral leader. Leaders are expected to possess ethical strength, walk the talk, and constantly demonstrate a genuine commitment to both personal and company missions. Moral leaders guide themselves with values and ethics. And when we talk values, we think of integrity, respect, honesty, fairness, and responsibility. Leaders recognize that their self is not the most important thing, and that leadership is about serving others, not about self-interest. True leaders value other people and put the interests of others first. Leaders do not impose their values on others. They consider other people's values and interact with and understand others. Moral leaders don't fear change. They have the courage to share a vision to try and bring about positive change. Immoral leadership, on the other hand, is the total opposite. It seeks to take away from others to enhance oneself. Moral leaders such as Raoul Gustav Wallenberg, who was a Swedish architect, businessman, diplomat, and humanitarian, put his life on the line to save thousands of Jews in the later stages of World War II in 1944. However, he subsequently died in a prison in Moscow in 1947. When we think of immoral leaders, people like Adolf Hitler, who was a leader of the Nazi Party, and during his dictatorship, He initiated World War II in Europe by invading Poland in 1939, which saw the genocide of millions of Jews and other victims. Moral leadership is something everyone can strive for. There are three levels of moral development. American psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development. This is where we revisit a little psychology. Those three steps include pre-conventional morality. This speaks to the obedience and punishment orientation. B.F. Skinner's theory of operant conditioning comes to mind, positive and negative reinforcement, and so on. A leader in this position would tend to be autocratic, which means to rule from a position of power, not taking into account other person's opinions. This type of leader would be what we call an unethical leader, which we saw earlier in this presentation. Conventional morality, which is good interpersonal relationships and maintaining the social order. The individual is good in order to be seen as being a good person by others. Leaders at this level follow the rules, norms, and values in the corporate culture, meaning that whatever rules the organization may have, whether good or bad, right or wrong, they will adhere to those rules. And then post-conventional morality, or the principle level, social contract and individual rights, or universal principles. Leaders at this level are guided by an internalized set of principles universally recognized as right or wrong, and may even disobey rules that violate these principles. The expectations of other people within the organization and community are not as important as these internalized values, and the leader is committed to serving others and a higher cause. This type of leader would be what we term an ethical leader. Leaders can use an understanding of the three levels of personal morality development to enhance their own followers' moral development and to initiate ethics training programs to move people to higher levels of moral reasoning. Servant leadership. Much of the thinking about leadership today implies that moral leadership encourages change towards turning followers into leaders, thereby developing their potential rather than using a leadership position to control or limit people. The ultimate expression of this leadership approach is called servant leadership. Traditionally, organizations were based on the idea that the leader is in charge of the subordinates, and the success of the organization depended on the leader being in control of the followers. There are 8 common leadership styles, and these leadership styles can be divided into 2 groups: leader-centered styles and follower-centered styles. Leader-centered styles achieve organizational success through the self-realization and self-projection of the leader, and these styles are primarily found in organizations that rely on authority, specific directions, and strict deadlines for success. Employees are expected to follow the leader's direction. Follower-centered leadership style. This achieves organizational success through the realization, growth, and development of the followers. These leadership styles are practiced in organizations that treat employees as the most valuable organizational assets, investing available resources in them. Can anyone give me an example of a leader-centered style and a follower-centered style? Hello? Anyone?
Carrie Griffith, leader-centered.
All right, Colin, thanks. Okay, let's look. Here are some examples of leader-centered and follower-centered styles. So under leader-centered styles, we have authoritarian, transactional, charismatic, and autocratic. And under follower-centered styles, we have participative, stewardship, transformational, and servant leadership. Let us now look at the comparison of the servant leadership approach to other approaches. And here we have figure of these different stages. In stage 1, the authoritarian leader, the subordinates are accepting without resistance. They are expected to do as they are told. Stage 2, the participative leader involves subordinates more actively in their own work. They are team players. Stage 3, stewardship leader. There's a significant shift in mindset by moving responsibility and authority from leaders to followers. These are self-responsible employees. And stage 4, servant leader. At this stage, leaders give up control and make a choice to serve employees. During these stages, the focus of leadership shifts from leader to follower. Authoritarian management. This type of leadership represents absolute power, the absolute power of the leader over the followers. Followers have no voice and have no discretion as to how they perform their jobs. The leader tends to keep all the decision-making authority to themselves. They operate by the do-as-I-say rule. Participative management. This type of leadership style involves the entire team. This is where the leader works closely with team members, focusing on building relationships and rapport. Stewardship management. This style of leadership is based on the role and practices of the steward as one who manages the resources of others in order to accomplish their objectives. Leaders give followers the power to influence goals, systems, and structures and become leaders themselves. Under stewardship, we have 4 principles which provide a framework for stewardship. 1, reorient toward a partnership assumption. Partnership can happen only when power and control shifts away from the former leaders to core workers. Partners have the right to say no to one another. They are totally honest with one another, neither hiding information nor protecting the other from bad news. In addition, partners are jointly responsible for defining vision and purpose and jointly accountable for outcomes. And when we say partners, we speak to leaders and followers. Localize decisions and power to those closest to the work and the customer. Decision-making power and the authority to act should reside right at the point where the work gets done. This means reintegrating the managing and the doing of work so that everyone is doing some of the core work of the organization part of the time. Nobody gets paid simply to plan and manage the work of others. Number 3, recognize and reward the value of labor. The reward systems tie everyone's fortunes to the success of the enterprise. Stewardship involves redistributing wealth by designing compensation so that core workers can make significant gains when they make exceptional contributions. Everyone earns his or her pay by delivering real value, and the organization pays everyone as much as possible. And number 4, expect core work teams to build the organization. Teams of workers who make up the core of the organization or divisions define goals, maintain control, create a nurturing environment, and organize and reorganize themselves to respond to a changing environment and the marketplace they serve. Excuse me. I will now hand you over to my group member, Phil Gabriel, to continue this presentation.
Thank you, Lisa. Am I being heard? As we go over to continue on with servant leadership, servant leadership is leadership that is considered to be upside down. It means like you're serving from the bottom up. Hello, am I being heard? Hello?
Yes, you are.
Yes,
okay then.
hear
Yes, I just check in. Thank you. Yes, servant leadership is leadership that is termed to be upside down, serving from the bottom up. But according to Robert Wood Johnson, guy who built Johnson & Johnson, he puts it simply as servant leadership could just be expressed as to serve. It also helps others to grow and develop. He sees leadership as servant leadership, a leadership which flows out of the act of service. But there are some priorities of servant leaders and servant leadership, and it cuts through all the self-interest. It serves the needs of others. And when we look at others, who are we looking at? And that means the employees, the customers, the shareholders, the general public, because the servant leader see value in what they do for the others, not the value in what they do for themselves. It is way beyond self-interest. The purpose of their existence, they understand it. It is to serve. But some examples of servant leadership, I'd just like to share with you. And you might see the name here of Linda Brusinski. I don't know if that's right. The president of Molly Maid International, and guys like David Duffield, founder and former owner of PeopleSoft. But in the case of Linda, servant leadership was demonstrated more so by one of the workers. When Linda Brusinski became the president of Molly Maid International, and Molly Maid International is an international cleaning service in varying countries, from UK to Canada to the USA, right? She learned about servant leadership from one of her cleaners. And she posed as a new member of staff and went out with this cleaner one day. And when she got to a location where the cleaner had to do a job, she met so much dirtiness at the residence that she wanted to just turn her mind away from everything. Dishes pile up, everything thrown about. But the worker shared with her that the owner of the house, a female, is going through a bitter divorce situation with her husband. And she has 3 rebellious sons. And the only form of control this woman felt that she had was a clean house. So the worker went beyond, the worker from Molly Maid went beyond to make sure that this woman could feel a sense of peace. And that was seen as a core thing of servant leadership. She understands it's not just about going out there and do the job, but I want to serve you in the capacity to make you comfortable. In the situation of David Duffield in PeopleSoft. Now, PeopleSoft lost a bitter battle against Oracle takeover, right? Those are those software people. And what would have happened? Duffield offered $10,000 of his own money to each employee who lost their job. Now, this is a sharp contrast of today's leaders, right? Because I'm sure that we could all remember that even when the COVID situation started and people were losing their job, there was a call by persons in high office to even take salary cuts. But did that ever happen? If you did, if you know, I don't. But that's the idea of servant leadership. Leadership has different dimension. And it is stated that it is not possible to display all of the dimensions of leadership at the same time. So it is interesting that you would have to think about it and see what dimension you fall. Now, there's a little exercise we will do at the end of the presentation where you could determine which dimension you fall into. But there are 4 precepts of servant leadership according to Greenleaf model. And you might ask yourself, well, who is Greenleaf? Robert Greenleaf is the founder of the modern servant leadership movement. And he published an essay in 1970, which really started to itemize what servant leadership is all about. But he puts it this way, and his 4 precepts comes across like this. Put service before self-interest. And what he's saying here, servant leaders makes a conscious choice to use their gift in the cause of change and growth for other individuals and for the organization. He established a desire to help others takes precedence over the desire to achieve a formal leadership position or to attain power and control over others. The servant leader calls for doing what is good and right for others, even if it does not pay off financially. And in his view, the organization exists as much to provide meaningful work to the person as the person exists to perform work for the organization. He also presented that servant leaders must learn to listen first to affirm others. And one of the servant leaders' greatest gifts to others is listening, to fully understand the problems others face and to affirm his confidence in others. A servant leader tries to figure out the will of the group and then further it in whichever way he can. The leader doesn't impose his or her will on others. By understanding others, the leaders can contribute to the best course of action. He went further to say that a servant leader must inspire trust by being trustworthy. Don't tell me something to do now and you're doing the total opposite. So servant leaders build trust by doing what they say they will do, being totally honest with others, giving up control and focusing on the well-being of others. They share all information, good and bad, and they make decisions to further the good of the group rather than their own interests. In addition, he also presented that servant leaders, the trust grows from trusting others to make their own decisions. Servant leaders gain trust because they give everything away. They give away the power, they give away the control, they give away the rewards, that information and recognition. The trust allow others to flourish. Nothing is more scary than somebody who just don't trust you. You're not sure whether they're going at the or they come in. If they tell you to run, you're studying whether to stand up or whether to, and that is very integral for servant leadership. His fourth precept, he looks at nourishing others and helping them become whole. Not selfish. So he sees it that servant leaders care about followers' spirits as well as their minds and their bodies. They believe in the unique potential of each person to have a positive impact on the world. Servant leaders help others find the power of the human spirit, accept their responsibilities. To accept their responsibilities, sorry. And this requires an openness and willingness to share in the pain and difficulties of others. Being close to people also means leaders make themselves vulnerable to others and are willing to show their own pain and humanity. But there are components of servant leadership. And some of those components are to have a strong moral. It also means valuing and respecting others as human beings and not seeing them as just objects of work. They must be trusting of others. There's also a belief in the purpose, a higher than acquiring more material goods for oneself. Don't do it because you could get the best benefit, probably financially or recognition. It's much more than that. And Greenleaf believe that many people have the capacity for servant leadership, where they act from moral values rather than from greed, rather than from selfishness and fear. And he puts it this way. He said that the greatest enemy to organizations and to society is fuzzy thinking. Fuzzy thinking on the part of good, intelligent, vital people who have the potential, and I quote, who have the potential to lead but not lead, or who choose to follow a non-servant, end of quote. And what he's simply saying, there are people who are good leaders who sits by and they have what it takes to be a servant leader, and they choose to stay in the back and they would just see things go along, and they allow themselves to be led by people who are supposed to be followers and that kind of story. So it's very important that you recognize your own dimension of leadership and those around you and how they could function and encourage the growth. But as we go on, you must have courage in which to do such. So there is leadership within courage, or as they would term it, leadership courage. And throughout this chapter, and I'm sure we've heard in our lifetime where people said he or she had no backbone, no guts, no fortitude, you know. And with leadership courage, doing the right thing requires that courage. But leaders sometimes have to reach deep within themselves to find the strength and courage to resist temptation. And we know that there could be numerous temptations out there, right? Or to stand up for moral principles when others may ridicule them. So if somebody might call you, you're real foolish for doing X, Y, Z. Why you didn't just hush your mouth? Why you couldn't just leave that be, let it take its own course? But you came forward with courage despite what you think could happen. And without courage, leadership can't exist. So for many years, for many leaders, particularly those working in large organizations, the importance of courage is easily obscured. The main thing is to get along, fit in, and do whatever brings promotions and pay raises. I'm sure that we could all think about some situations, or be it in the media or otherwise, that we could pinpoint this to. But what is courage? Anybody care to share what their idea of courage might be? Anybody? Anybody courageous enough to say? Hello?
Standing up for what is right. Standing up for what is right and ethical.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else?
I was the ability to do something that, you know, others may be frightened to do. A sense of
being afraid and doing it anyway.
You all are all correct. All right. And we're looking at it. What is courage? And most people know intuitively that courage can carry you through deprivation, ridicule, and rejection, and enable you to achieve, it could still enable you to achieve something about which you care deeply. So you might get the ridicule, you might get the deprivation, you might get the rejection, but you might still be able to achieve it. Courage is both a moral and a practical matter for leaders, because a lack of it is what allows greed, self-interest to overcome concerns for the common good. The old philosophy of courage is don't fail. Let someone else take the risk. You leave that alone. Be careful. Don't make mistake. But indeed, the courage to take risk has always been important for living. I'm sure you could remember when you yourself, you may not have seen it as courageous, but you took courage to do something that was important for living. But the defining characters of courage, what are they? It isn't the absence of doubt or fear, but is the ability to act in spite of them. So all that you all would have mentioned earlier on, Judy, Angelitos, Kanisha, you realize it all came into here, right? It is the ability to step forward through fear, to accept responsibility, to take a risk, to make changes, to speak your mind, and to fight for what you believe. And US Senator John McCain said it, and I quote, "Fear is the opportunity for courage, not proof of cowardice." And what he means, if you didn't become fearful, then it was just something you was just doing. That was natural for you. But if you was scared when you thought about taking the chance, your courage started to act in, right? But consider this. Charles Darwin, who would have spoken Origin of His Species, he put off the publishing of his Origin of Species for 2 decades because he feared public scorn and ridicule from his peers. But many fears are learned and prevent people from doing what they want. Some of my ideas for or the examples of courageous leaders for me that came out in doing this chapter are people like Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights movement. You think Martin Luther didn't know that at any time he could get hit? That would be it for him. Nelson Mandela against apartheid. Despite what went on, he still continued to fight against apartheid. So we have, and I'm sure if we continue to look, we'll find great examples of courageous leaders. But courage has a line of meaning, and it means accepting responsibility. Leaders make a real difference in the world when they are willing to step up and take personal responsibility. Some people let life happen to them, but leaders make things happen. You want to make the change, you have to start to enact it. Courageous leaders create opportunity to make a difference in the organizations that they work in and around, and also within their communities. Protesting leaders also demonstrate courage by openly taking responsibility for their failures and mistakes, rather than avoiding blame or shifting it to others. Now, a lot of leaders normally just try to push things under the carpet and just leave it be. It's gonna blow away. We say here it's a 9-day wonder. Something else will come up and nobody will speak about it again. Courage often means non-conformity. So you came into the organization and we're accustomed doing things one way because that's the culture, but it's totally wrong, unethical, immoral, and otherwise. You decide you're going to initiate the change. I'm not going to conform to this because it's not right. Right? You're going against the grain. You're breaking traditions. You're taking a chance to improve because you're breaking traditions not because you just want to go against anything, you know, but because it's not right and you want to make it better. You reduce boundaries. You start taking risks for a larger ethical purpose and you encourage others to do so. Courage also means going beyond the comfort zone. Persons encounter an internal wall of fear when they do something they are not accustomed doing. Not so? Remember when you went on our first date? Or when you chose to confront the boss on an issue that everybody telling you leave alone? You took courage. It took courage to do that. You know? Or when you decided to change career, even to come in to do this program, I believe it took some courage. And it's taken even more courage for you to stay because it's going long, right? Anybody agree? But we finished just now. All right? Facing the internal wall of fear is when courage is most needed. But courage means asking for what you want and saying what you think. So leaders have to speak out to influence others. And however, the desire to please others, especially boss, can sometimes block the truth. But throughout this whole thing, I want us to just look at what we mean by the Albertine paradox. And the Albertine paradox really refers to a situation where no member of a group decides to contest a decision taken by the group, believing it to be the consensus of everyone, when in reality, and this is the part, when in reality, none of the group members agree with the decision. I'm sure we've been part of that time and time again. I remember attending meetings with some superiors, and there was this superior who would say, I came here to say something, and I don't want any questions after this. In his mind, he didn't want anybody to question whatever he wanted to say. If it made sense, you stop there. Whatever he's saying, it was coming out as an instruction any which way, and you were left to deal with that. And then these things brings about sub-meeting afterwards that still tried to rationalize the decision or what was being said. But courage means speaking your mind even when you know others may disagree with you and may even deride you. So I said that to say this. I got myself in a lot of trouble. All right? But don't ask me who was the superior. Courage means also fighting for what you believe. It means taking a risk for a higher purpose, fighting for value, taking risks that do not offer the possibility of valuable and ethical outcomes. It is at best foolish and sometimes evil because you'd sometimes go through a lot. But it's what courage is all about. And sometimes to find that courage, you need to get it personally. And how does a leader find the courage to step through fear and confusion? Or to act despite the risk involved? You know that they go ridicule you. You know you might get your paid doc XYZ. They choose to push through that fear that limits our comfort zone and stand in the way of being our best and accomplishing our goals. The higher purpose overshadows concerns about his or her own self-interest. But as a leader, you could find personal courage by committing to something you deeply believe in. You can welcome potential failure also, because sometimes we think that failure is a bad thing. Welcome potential failure as a means of growth and development, and build bonds of caring and mutual support with family, friends, and colleagues to reduce fear. Draw strength from others, because sometimes we go through things and we stay there quietly and we suffer quietly, whereas a little support from someone else could help and encourage us to have a little more courage in this circumstance. So we look now at opposing unethical conduct. Are we still there? And that takes courage. Are we still there? Anybody there?
We all here.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
No, I just had to make sure a little, no, and I know my voice could be a little boring at times, but please bear with me. I'm almost there. So opposing unethical conduct, that requires courage. And one of the ways for doing that is through whistleblowing. And we would have all dealt with some whistleblowing back in some other classes that we have done. But I want to share with you, even as you view this slide, I want to share with you an example of courage as it relates to whistleblowing and whatnot. A lady by the name of Colleen Rowley, a Minneapolis FBI staff attorney, she wrote a whistleblowing letter and called it to attention the agency's shortcoming that may have contributed to the September 11th, 2001 terrorist tragedy. And what is important that a colleague of Rowley said, she said that she always does what is right, even when no one is watching. So it tells me that her ethical stance is intact. I don't need for somebody to tell me what is right. I could see what is right and I'm gonna deal with it, whether you're watching or you're not watching. But nowadays, the smart companies are beginning to see whistleblowing as a benefit rather than a threat. Because there are some downsides to whistleblowing where people feel that they might lose their job, be ostracized, or be transferred to undesirable position. But the smart companies see them as a benefit. And on one survey, it found that 88% of the respondents agreed that whistleblowing is good for business. It means that it gets them and the organization to be on track, to be doing the right thing. But how does courage apply to moral leadership? And it's interesting that you must have morals, because that's one of the components to be a courageous leader. So it does apply. And there are many people in organizations who have the courage to be unconventional, to do what they think is right, to dare to treat employees and customers as whole human beings who desire respect, balancing profit with people, self-interest with service, and control with stewardship, this requires individual moral courage. Because it's very important. You could just see dollars and cents and what is going up, and you know what? Hey, you start screaming and shouting at your employees, and you don't realize you're degrading them, and it's not making much sense, and they're producing less. But acting like a moral leader requires personal courage. To practice moral leadership, leaders have to know themselves, understand their strengths and weaknesses, and know what they stand for, and often be non-conformists. Welcoming failure. To most people, when you fail, it's a really sad thing. And it may be a sad thing. I'm sure to some of us, when we got, if ever any of us got low marks in some of our courses as we went through, we saw it as failure, but we used it as something positive. And when people accept failure and are at peace with the worst possible outcome, they find they have the fortitude to move forward. So that made us realize we needed to push a little more. We need to do some more stuff. Leaders know that failure can lead to success, and that the pain of learning strengthens individuals and the organization. So you see the little note on the right-hand side? Failure is a key to success. There's also a situation of where we may have to sometimes harness some frustration. And if you've really been angry about something, you know that it can cause you to forget about fear of embarrassment or fear that others won't like you. You might say it, we say it this way, I don't care who vex loss, not so? So Glenn McIntyre, this guy used his frustration to start a new life and a new business. After he was paralyzed in a motorcycle accident, McIntyre first used his anger to overcome the thoughts of suicide. He began intensive physical therapy. Later, his frustration over how poorly hotels served differently abled guests, that led him to start a consulting firm called Access Design. Now the firm helps hotels and quality suites redesign their space to be more usable for disabled or differently abled travelers. So you see the frustration that was within him pushed him to do something better, to change a life, to change his life, to change life for others. He started to do things for others, not just for him, because he saw there are other people like him going through a similar situation. But we'd like to summarize what we've just went through on courage and moral leadership. At the end of it, people want honest, trustworthy leaders. And the ethical climate in many organizations today is at a low point. Right? Leaders by themselves, they face a certain amount of pressure to do the right thing. Right? And creating an ethical organization requires that leaders act based on moral principles. Courage, as it goes along, it means it is the ability to step forward. And step forward through fear, to accept the responsibility to take risks and to make changes, to speak your mind, and to fight for what you believe. And two expressions of courage in organization are moral leadership and ethical whistleblowing. And some of the sources of courage, they include belief in a higher purpose, connection with others, experience with failure, and harnessing anger. All of the areas that we have touched on as we went through this chapter. Now, ideas about control versus service between leaders and followers are changing and expanding. And there are variations of the continuum. And these changes are reflected in this continuum of leader to follower relationship. The continuum varies from authoritarian managers to participative managers to stewardship and servant leadership. Leaders who operate from the principles of stewardship and servant leadership can help greatly in building ethical organizations. So I want to leave you with a little exercise that I mentioned earlier on when we were discussing ethical and unethical. Now, because it's going to take some time, I'll leave you to do it on your own. It's just 16 questions where you go through your thought. It helps you to determine which dimension of leadership that you would fall into. So I would just simply scroll through it. And I would like for us to just do it and see where we fall, because it's very interesting. And as we go on, we could help ourselves to be better leaders or channel others as we go along in their leadership growth. So we also have the scoring and interpretation part of it, which would help us to determine where we fall in it. I'd like to leave one little thing with you. Consider, is it worth the risk? And as you go through this, you'd realize risk must be taken, because the greatest hazard is in life is to risk nothing. We risk a lot of things as we go about in life. And as we evolve to be better leaders, to be leaders, and to encourage persons to be better leaders, we would have to risk a few things. So I encourage you, in your walk to leadership, be willing to risk something. You have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. There ends the presentation by Lisan Alcala and Phil Gabriel. Thank you. Any questions? Hello?
All right, if there are no questions, I'll stop the recording now.